What does it mean as a writer to choose your subject as your subject practices which are generally not literary or linguistic, which are visual, which have sometimes refused intelligibility through the written word? Why then write about it? And I'm interested in writing and art writing as a form of translation. I'm interested in writing about art as a hybrid practice. This is the manifesto bit. And thinking about it as a space not in between word and image, but composed in and of both. I'm concerned with writing as a critical practice, a mode of critique, a tool for challenging hegemonies and preserving histories that I worry will be lost, misinterpreted, or rewritten. In my work and in my life, I am interested in queer feminist critique as a way of life, a praxis. And I like to think about criticality as something lived, something like art, and writing that we can be deeply invested in, rather than a rhetorical strategy or a literary flourish. What would happen if we thought about writing as a way of life? But also I wanted to think, how could I put front and center, not try and get rid of it, my emotional investment and attachment in what I'm writing about, and moved readers to think about gaps, omissions, things that haven't been preserved properly, mistranslations in their own lives. So there's discussion points here. Really, I just want you to have a discussion about what do we actually mean by the... I guess you've talked about the writing part and about art criticism, and I kind of want to think about critical writing. What do we actually mean by that? What's the relationship between word and image there? And basically, why do we write about art? Because I'm suggesting it's sort of an act of translation. Why do we do it, basically? But there's a couple of prompts. The other one is this art historian, Boris Groys, who mostly writes about art and post-communism in Eastern Europe, but I like this phrase of his: almost every artist I know wants to be critical. So what should an art critic do if the art itself is critical? So I thought that might be quite an interesting prompt for discussion as well. So we discuss for maybe 30, 40 minutes and then come back. Is that clear? I guess coming out of my group, the two things that I wanted to see what others were kind of talking about is what the relationship between the artist and the writer is, can be, should be, your feelings on that, and what it means to be critical. That's something that came up in my introduction, and also just to hear about anything else that's come up in your group discussions, and I'll try and note some of it down on the paper here. Does anyone want to start us off?
One of the things we agreed on is it's a value judgment of an artwork, and also because many times, generally when people talk about criticism, others will think about it as a form of censure, which has always come out very, very, from my practice, I find that very common, because I have a personal experience working in mainstream media, and I remember an experience where my editor was telling me, don't write about art in a way that people will not come to exhibitions. Write about art in a way that people will come to exhibitions.
Yeah.
So, I write in a way that I entice people to come and see the shows, and not because I think he had that kind of thinking that my writing was going to censure the art. But it's interesting when you look at it from that perspective.
This is something that came up in our group as well, kind of thinking about what is the relationship of the writer to the market. That sometimes it's about the work that you're doing, and as a writer, writing about an artwork is making it saleable, or making an institution kind of commercially interesting, viable.
Yes. So again, we went on, and this also brings us into the notion of not dwelling so much on the negative, yeah, but more, if there's any positive, you can talk about it. Yeah.
Okay, who would like to add anything to that, or
So our group, there's a lot of food for thought and musings that came in. Like we went on so many details. It was a good opportunity to just think through things. And one of what we talked about was how the art of the critic is almost like to democratize art, to slash liberate art, especially. So I say that because it's seen as an elitist thing, sort of like taking it away from the elite centers down to the masses. But then someone also said that, but actually even in the lower income areas, there's also the creation of art. There's a creation of art in the ghettos, there's creation of art in the slums. And that was like just so fascinating for me to think about how so the critic then has that role of sort of enriching two worlds. Yeah, so that was just very interesting food for thought. Just the role of the critic.
so there might be a sort of a history of that role as being one which it has an elitist sort of function, but but you can get away from that as a writer.
Yeah, and I think that's what my other colleague, I think it was Ivy, who said that's what came up, that that's a possibility moving forward, that actually has not been explored much, but there certainly is a lot of potential for that.
How do you think we might get there? Or
I think if we set the intention, and I think it's necessary, because it takes us back to the question that you asked about why write about art, which takes us to the question of why is art important? Yeah.
so why write about art is another way of phrasing that question is why is art important? Is that what you kind of they're
Why is
similar
art important?
they're similar questions.
Then yes,
Yeah.
yes, they are related.
If critical doesn't mean negative, what else might it mean? That was something we were discussing in our.
I think that something that kept coming up in our discussions was that the role of critique or criticism is to say why something is important. And I think that something can be important in many ways. And so you can talk about a piece of artwork that you don't necessarily like, but it adds something to the conversation. And I think that that was another defining thing that we came up with, is that critique or criticality is feeding into an ongoing conversation and putting somebody's work in a broader context. And we had a lot of discussion about, I think that we had some frustration with defining these words which look so similar, and that led to us talking about whether or not criticism has the function of democratizing art or making art more accessible to different audiences, if we are getting bogged down in these words which are basically academics, scratching each other's backs, rather than, us making work more accessible or telling the audience why this work is important, which I think is one of the major roles of the critic.
And what about art writing that uses, I want to think a bit more about the relationship between the writer and the artist, because quite a lot of this criticism, this discussion about criticism is about the writer, sort of in service to the artist and kind of explaining and contextualizing their work. And we were talking a lot about, well, what about where do we place, what do we think of art writing which uses an artwork to kind of riff on a theme that might be kind of loosely related to the work, but it's not about describing it, it's not about evaluating it. I was sharing about a piece I'd written about a colleague's work where I'd kind of ended up talking about a funeral that I'd been to, just because it kind of made me think about that when I went to see the work, but it wasn't really about the work. So where might we place art writing that riffs off an artwork rather than describes or evaluates it? Is that something that came up in your discussions, or anyone from my group want to Right. Right.
We were starting to talk about like art writing. Can it be a separate genre that's not necessarily dependent on the art form itself? And when we started talking about that, we started to think, is there a way that art writers can start to use that art form? And we talked about examples about how they've used the art itself as a platform to jump off and speak about often sometimes completely separate topics. So I think some of the things that came out from that is that yes, we can see the ways it can sort of transcend its specific role, but in many ways, we do and I think I like the language you use, Pamela, is about respect about that work and making sure that you've taken like a 360-degree view of that work, you know, and assuring that you're doing the artist and the art justice before you start to do that. That said, I did flag that I think that to me is possible if it's done thoughtfully and critically, if I can use that word. If particularly because then it allows us hopefully to start to see, if not that specific art, better, more thoughtfully as like audience members, as other people who are experiencing that art, as a way to look and experience other artworks better, more thoughtfully in the future. So it's also building the space of criticism and art experiencing broadly, not just for that specific artist.
Yeah, and thank you. And can you just keep it for 1 second, because I want to ask you one more thing. We talked a lot about, I think it's important to emphasize that we were really thinking that criticism is not code breaking. It's not about kind of cracking the code of the meaning of a particular work, but and that idea that critical thinking is about deep contextual thinking, and that done well it can shape how you see lots of different artworks. The reason I asked you to keep the mic is because we were talking a lot about the relationship between artist and writer, and how can it be more mutual. And you came up with an analogy. Do you want to share? We pushed a couple of metaphors
really did
very far.
This metaphor, but we're thinking about the rhino and the little bird that's usually on the back of the rhino. So sort of, in many ways, art writing is still dependent and reliant on this separate genre, this art itself. But we started to think, how are the ways in which that relationship is much more, much less like. How to say it? It's not a hierarchy, it's like much more of a deeper symbiotic that is the word, yes, a symbiotic relationship. So that's kind of how we were trying to frame that.
Thank you. Does anyone have any final thoughts that they want to share before we move on to the next?
About how art criticism is also care work, and it requires a generosity of thought, like you actually attend to this other person, and rather than just saying that was trash. I think it really requires more kind of emotional labor from the art writer.
Thank you. Yeah, I really like that idea of criticism and art writing as a kind of emotional labor. Yeah. I'm just going to write emotional labor down here. And I started with, you don't necessarily need to agree. There's a lot of metaphors and analogies flying around. I'd said if words are our raw material, what tools do we need to use in the practice of making our writing? So that's one thing to think about, and that can be practical things as well as kind of intellectual things. And one that's really important to me and will come up a bit more tomorrow as well is we've talked about the relationship between the artist and the art writer. Within that discussion, it's very much about within a particular art scene, but I think it's important that we learn from and explore our relationship to other fields and disciplines and practices, some of which are artistic and creative, others which are not. So what fields, disciplines and practices outside of art or art writing do you learn and draw inspiration from? So for me, for example, I'm really influenced by poetry, particularly feminist poetry. So I'll talk about that more tomorrow, but that's an example. It's not to do with art, it's not to do with art history, but I like to use that as a place to take inspiration from because it's got nothing, it doesn't have a clear relationship to it. So I want us to think about how being interdisciplinary thinkers can help inform our art writing. And this is about moving towards thinking, what are our methods? So the other question to ask ourselves is, what practices from our everyday lives might shape and influence our writing? So that might be something like thinking about writing through a metaphor like walking, like you're going from, you have an objective, a place that you want to get to. As you move, you meet people along the way. So thinking about that as a metaphor. But I want you to think of what are your own methods? What do you draw inspiration from your everyday lives that could help us think about writing, and the practical question of how writing actually happens. The idea is that we'll come back to this discussion on Friday at the end of the week and see what's changed, whether there's anything we would add or amend after we've done more writing and editing together on Thursday and Friday. Does anyone have any questions? Or you've got that. It's on the other side of the handout. So let's take. We don't have much time, so let's take 20 minutes to discuss and then feedback.
Art for those art as defined let's say by the West. You have to look into.
So just share a couple of points from your discussion.
One of our colleagues has a system of brainstorming and word associations. So she can have a word like big kafunda, and that sort of sets off a certain chain of thought. And then we have a person who sort of practices deliberate randomness to sort of wear out the possibilities of creating new ideas and discovering new ways. And then we have a person who does most of his work in his brain. So he marinates the idea in his head for like almost 80% of the time. And then for 20%, he sits. So I think until he's like saturated with absorbing all this information, he can, and then he begins to work. Okay. And then of course we had the usual tools like camera, laptop, pen, paper. Then we had things like perspective, time, and image.
Yeah, okay.
Then the second question, that what inspires you? I'm personally inspired by manga and science. So I explained that for me, I like how manga and cartoons break the rules. There's no physics. People fall, die, they burst and come back together. So I like the way they break the rules of storytelling in manga, and for me, I believe that if a manga artist can break those rules, why can't I? Can't I discover new ways to share or allow people to see? Then we had film, music, and someone who's inspired by the abnormal, and then psychology, and then I don't think we had time to discuss how interdisciplinary thinking influences our methods.
Well, I think you've spoken to that a wee bit. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Anyone from another group want to come up?
We did talk a lot more about the different disciplines that inspire us. Poetry was one. Places of discomfort is not really a field, but it's a place you can write from. Food, physics, and Islamic philosophy. And one really cool thing from that Alex was sharing was, I think you called it Celia?
Yes,
Close enough. Which is like citation is connection, and I think the way she was describing it was kind of looking at her intellectual ancestors, all the people who've thought before you, and you connect yourself to them. And we talked actually a little bit more practically about methodology. So listening to stories from people, but especially old women, writing introductions, and just thinking about how people introduce themselves and maybe what they emit. Mine particularly is just reading a lot or researching a lot and then sleeping. Yeah, because I believe if you just read and take in all the information about what you want to write, when you sleep, your brain just organizes it for you, and you wake up and start writing. On the best days, on the worst days, you wake up and you sleep again. Another one was free writing, to just get what's off the top of your head. And an interesting one was working through a pseudonym, if you feel you need to remove yourself a bit from your writing. And we talked about it also as, it can be many things. It can be negative, it can be erasure, but it can also give you the authority maybe to write something you didn't feel you could write. Yeah, did I miss anything?
Well, you can write some of them down as well if you want to later. And who's from another spokesperson from another group?
One thing that I mentioned was that I need to find the thing in the topic that I'm writing about that makes me excited. So emotionality or excitement and passion, and using that to actually get you to sit down and do the writing. And another thing that we discussed was narrative, either in telling stories or folk songs. A lot of times when we're writing something dry or academic, then a narrative sort of helps people connect to the writing and just keeps it interesting.
Okay.
I think that's the interesting.
Great. So any group that's not spoken, do you want to, yeah.
I'm just gonna break down just the bullet points that we came up with. And from the tools, we have quotations from other artists, reading, that includes storytelling and whatever, imagination. As we both know, like, writing can be non-fiction and fictional, so we have to kind of like always use the imagination. Kind of like a relation and kinds of how do you relate to a subject or whatever you're thinking about or something. So it's more like real life experiences, as you mentioned. And we have also like, that comes also with connection, plus the dictionary. Once in a while, you can get like a... So the fields, disciplines or practices, the interdisciplinary thinking, we put like generally like life as a whole, like, you know, it has like a lot of things in it. We have the culture, we have the traditions, we have anthropology, and she mentioned the commercial videos, just kind of like how it you can relate to something. I don't know. I don't want to like explain that. It's my point. And imagination as well, because it kind of also like runs and intertwines within this as well.
Yeah, thank you.
Another thing was just like having a mode of communication, whether it's like a WhatsApp group or like an email thread or whatever else. Art mapping, which was like if you're in a different space, you're sort of looking at your immediate environment and writing about it, and writing about whether it's the latest trend or whatever continuity you see, and then sort of compiling what everybody's saying in separate spaces into one centralized space, if that makes sense, right? And translation, which is like you read something that's not necessarily in English, but that pertains to what you're trying to do, and then you just translate it for the people in your group or for the people in your circle or whoever you're collaborating with.
Okay. Something to bear in mind with that, obviously draw on all the discussions that we've had and that you've had the previous day, but also one idea is that by the end of the week, or at the end of the week, and particularly Thursday, Friday, we work together on producing a small zine of writing that we've made this week. Thanks everyone for such great participation and discussions. That was brilliant. Yeah.